Under a state of emergency with tens of thousands fleeing their homes, has peace fallen apart in Colombia? A 2016 deal with the country's largest rebel group was supposed to lead to total peace. But in the Catatumbo region on the border with Venezuela, the National Liberation Army and others continue to fight, claiming the government has failed to deliver. So has disarming one group simply empowered others who still profit from the illegal drug trade? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Colombia. Well, it was a historic moment in Colombia's troubled history when a peace deal was signed with the country's biggest rebel movement, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. After more than half a century of civil war, there was finally hope that progress was being made, especially with a former rebel fighter as president. Today, though, Gustavo Petro is fighting to salvage any semblance of peace from that historic deal with one of the most brutal outbreaks of violence and instability unfolding on Colombia's border with Venezuela. Here's a look.
Colombia's search for total peace is falling apart. Clashes began in the country's northwest region of Catatumbo between the National Liberation Army, or ELN, and remnants of the FARC military group in mid-January. The government responded with a state of emergency and sent thousands of troops to the area. The fighting so far has displaced more than 53,000 people and killed dozens.
There were bullets everywhere. The next day, everyone had to leave. We left with a few things. Clothes. We managed to take out about 3 things.
It is a major escalation in Colombia's 6-decade-long internal conflict that's killed 450,000 people. In 2016, Colombia signed a historic peace deal to end the war with FARC, the country's largest rebel group. But many smaller armed factions have since filled the void. An ex-guerrilla himself, Gustavo Petro took the presidency in 2022 with a promise of total peace. He negotiated with armed groups and launched social programs to end Colombia's endemic violence. He also reached a temporary truce with the ELN last year, but that's not been extended. Following the recent fighting, Petro suspended talks with the ELN, saying the group does not want peace. Meanwhile, the ELN now warns the government of a total war.
If more military continue to arrive in the territory, the confrontation will most likely continue, because we are going to defend ourselves, and we are going to defend ourselves as an insurgent force. We are going to defend our accumulated history because we have accumulated 50 years in Catatumbo.
Colombia's defense minister has responded defiantly, saying the insurgency will be met with the military's full force.
The problem is complex, but it can be solved. It requires work, effort, dedication. We are going to have to make a lot of sacrifice. We are even going to have tears. But in the end, we are going to achieve it.
People in the region are tired of the seemingly endless suffering and violence, and they are yearning for peace.
We want the war to stop. We are suffering. Many children, many grandparents, many people are suffering. We are suffering from this consequence of the war that we have nothing to do with.
The area of Colombia near the Venezuelan border is not the only problem. This month, in the southwest of the country, some of the soldiers who tried to regain control from guerrillas involved in the drug trade were taken hostage. And the crime rate is rising all across the country. President Gustavo Petro acknowledged that the upsurge in violence is a failure, but also called it a lesson. As Colombia appears poised for bigger fights to come, there is little sign of hope for an end to this decades-long battle against heavily armed and well-funded rebels.
So can there be peace in Colombia, or have insurgencies become a permanent fixture of the landscape? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Bogotá, foreign correspondent Richard McCall, from Nijmegen, Netherlands, assistant professor in peace and conflict studies at Radboud University, Sana Weber, and also from the Colombian capital, professor at University of the Andes School of Government, Felipe Roa-Clavijo. Thanks all so much for being with me. Richard, I'll start with you. Do you see Petro's deal as a total failure at this point? And if so, where did it or where did he really go wrong?
I don't know. I mean, there were two ways of looking at this. Thank you for having me. There's two ways of looking at this, and one is from the public perception, and the tide has certainly turned against President Petro when it comes to total peace and the cornerstone of his government policy. But then, of course, there's what is actually going on in the ground and the evolution of the conflict. That needs to be looked at when we discuss total peace and whether it's a failure or not. And also, well, how has the government responded to the challenges of the past 2 years? And they've moved really from what is a national dialogue, so working with groups like the ELN, which wanted to discuss economic reform and political reform, to more locally based dialogues with groups on the ground. So I don't know if it's fully a failure, but I don't know if the messaging is coming across.
I mean, it is incredibly complex. You're talking about decades and decades of fighting this battle. But in the end, is it a simple case of overpromising, kind of underestimating the real complexity of what was at hand, and Petro is now regretting maybe saying that this would be total peace within a few years? Richard, go ahead.
Well, yes, I think, thank you. I think, of course, he might regret these things, but President Petro is not one to regret things at all. He did overpromise. We knew that was happening. Of course, Colombia requires a lot of change, requires the reforms, is calling out for peace. When he stood up at his inauguration and talked openly about total peace, we have to say it was a refreshing look at the situation, the complexities in Colombia. For how long has this country been in a state of conflict? And to hear someone talking and speaking to the military as well and saying you're not going to be judged on lives taken, but lives saved. This was a refreshing look at things.
Felipe, are you on the same page as Richard there? And also, the approach taken now to be kind of fighting fire with fire and using the military to try and take the insurgents down, is that working?
Yeah, well, one of the main challenges is the lack of a comprehensive strategy for peace building. And this is connected with the peace accord that was signed in 2016. It was supposed to build local conditions for rural development, that is access to education, infrastructure, health, so that regions in the country will be better equipped to build development conditions. That strategy in the long term has been failing, and it has not quite achieved what it was supposed to in terms of development of communities and creating peace-building conditions. When rural development is not on top of the agenda, then the security conditions worsen. And that's a huge challenge that this government is facing at the moment.
Right, because at the very foundation of this conflict, from decades ago, it is still the poverty and the marginalization resulting from basically the poor governance that Colombians have witnessed over the decades. Yeah, can it be changed?
It has to do with state presence and how the state is building development conditions for rural population. It has the strategy of peace building has not also connected with the security strategy. So we have people who have signed the peace agreements, former combatants who are also being killed in these regions. So people who lay down their arms or weapons, and they are getting chased and killed in these conditions of worsening security. So this is also a long-term strategy that is failing for the country.
Okay, Sana, I'll turn to you now. I mean, first of all, do you think Gustavo Petro is using the proper approach? Because as we said at the foundations, there is the social distress, the poverty, the marginalization of so many people. And for the youth, they can argue, especially in rural areas, democracy hasn't served them. They have limited education and opportunities, so joining the rebels is an option. And with drug money involved, at least they get some sort of financial security, if I can go as far as to call it that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The conflict is so complex that there's no one easy solution to it. So, of course, military means can provide one option, but I think the experience also with the FARC has shown that it's not enough, right? And I think Felipe has already explained the really difficult conditions in a lot of Colombia's countryside. And to really demobilize armed groups, they also need to have incentives to lay down their arms, right? And for many members that were part of armed groups, laying down their arms is simply not a very appealing option if the alternative is going back to very rural communities that are very marginalized and where making like a decent living is very difficult. And with a team of researchers from the United Kingdom and several universities in Colombia, we've done research, for instance, in Quibdó, in Chocó, one of the poorest regions of the country, and we've really seen how complex it is. So young people there, they really feel that they have very few prospects for the future, right? There's extremely high levels of unemployment, high corruption, people have very little trust in the government, and on top of that, there's a lot of violence, also urban violence. So young people here really feel stuck, and then especially for young men, joining armed groups keeps being an option to gaining an income, but also gaining a status, especially a masculine status, if we also talk about gender relationships. So really fixing this problem is very complex and takes a long time, and also really investing in development, in giving young people alternative,
right,
which can be.
This is, I mean, this is a battle really fought around the world when it comes to dealing with poverty. But Richard, let me come back to you, because there's another potential layer of complication here, and that is the question of how much Venezuela is actually involved, especially when we talk about the regions on the border. It's more than just geography. It's alleged ties to the ELN and the alleged complicity, some say, of the Venezuelan government. What are you seeing there? Is there a deliberate intention here to complicate the situation for the Colombian government?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that. These regions along the border, of course, Catatumbo, I think you're referring to, Arauca, these areas which have always been out of government control, have really been the areas which show us today the complexities of a situation. How can you negotiate groups on a national level when it is now international with Venezuela? And this shows us as well how the conflict has evolved over time since 2016. Of course, there was, a movement between that porous border before 2016, but now we know for certain, of course. And it shows that it's a fragmented and multifaceted conflict that's going on, and these groups are basically criminal franchises. So how do you possibly address each one of them? The government at the moment is probably negotiating with varying degrees of success with about 10 different groups.
You say Catatumbo is out of government control. Is it out of government control, or has it just been ignored?
It's been ignored. Of course it has. It's been decades and decades of overlooking this area. It's been controlled by various different groups. Yes, the government has sent in, I guess, a battalion or so, and this will help. The military pressure will be critical as leverage for negotiation. But until, like Felipe and Sana says, until there is actual genuine investment on the ground to improve the lives and the basic human rights of people in this area, I don't see there being any change.
Right. Felipe, you know, there's another issue as well, in that at the end of the supply chain here are these customers. You know, cocaine is not a cheap drug. It usually goes to the wealthy in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere. And as long as that market exists there, it is going to give corrupt opportunities, criminal opportunities to disadvantaged people in developing countries, particularly in this case, Colombia. Is this being looked at? Now you have a very adversarial relationship between the Colombian government and the United States, for example. That doesn't help the problem, does it? If the demand for the drug trade is still there and the youth of Colombia is going to see opportunities in that.
Yeah, it is important to highlight that the drug trade is what is actually fueling the whole conflict. Of course, there are other economies such as illegal mining, but coca production is the main driver of trade and demand that it's happening in this context. And what is happening, Sana was already saying, in these isolated regions, there are no job opportunities. There are no prospects for living a better life, a good life for rural communities. And this is the space that drug traffickers are using to expand the coca crops. And actually, the coca crops have expanded after the peace accord. There was hope that the peace agreement of 2016 will voluntarily reduce the coca crops in the country, but it actually created the wrong incentives, because since there were some incentives for substitution, for voluntary substitution, more and more farmers with no other economic opportunities actually expanded the coca crops. And this creates a huge crisis in these coca producing territories, mainly because when the drug prices are high, they can make a living, they make deals with drug traffickers. But a few years back, the coca prices were actually down, and this created huge problems in these territories, mainly because they didn't have anything to eat. So it's connected with food insecurity, which is actually one of the research areas that I'm exploring at the moment.
I mean, speaking of food, one of the complaints you'll hear from some of the fighters, some that actually left and then came back, had said that the state had promised to subsidize crop substitution, so that they could stop growing coca and grow other crops to benefit, you know, the food chain and to keep their income. And they said that that was not delivered on. So trafficking and coca crops are what actually provides an income. Is that true? Did the government actually fail on that specific point?
This is a huge broken promise. And there is no doubt. The University of Andes recently conducted an evaluation of how was the process of delivering this support for voluntary substitution, mainly for rural farmers who were producing. And actually, a very small percentage of this support was delivered. So there's also a significant challenge in these people trusting or not the state.
Right. So, Sana, if these insurgents, rebel groups, whatever you want to call them, if they are choosing coca crops because they feel there is no other alternative, are groups like the ELN actually using the money that they earn, you know, to help the impoverished people, which was supposed to be their ultimate goal? They're supposed to be the Robin Hood for the poor. Does that even exist anymore, or are they simply narco traffickers by a definition?
That depends on who you ask. I think the ELN themselves still clearly wants to present a picture of them being defendants of the poor population. And this is also part of the reason they say that, the peace talks with the government are always so complicated, because according to them, the government doesn't want to deliver on this political and economic transformation of the Colombian country that the ELN say they are struggling for. But I think most commentators by now actually see that the ELN is just mostly interested in continuing their engagement in this drug and other illicit economies, rather than really being interested in a peace deal. So So they're actually performance in defense of the impoverished people and investment in them. Yeah, it's very
right. Richard, what do you make of that? I mean, how sincere are the goals, if I can put it that way, of most of these insurgent groups? Have they lost the plot, as you could say? It's not about fighting for the poor, fighting for better opportunities for their people. It's about making money, and they see an easy route if they cooperate with the illicit drug trade.
Well, I think obviously there are different levels to this as well. The ELN, finds their roots back in the 1960s, in the era of the Cold War. The older members, those that traveled to Venezuela and Cuba for peace talks, they may have political interests in this, and they may be able to say the right things when it comes to wanting to change the political and economic situation in the country. But it's a fragmented group. It has autonomous wings within it, some of which are more, let's say, they are more economically viable and others not. And it's very clear that the older members of the ELN do not have the final say over what's going on in the regions with their other groups. To say that now that they are still involved in politics, I think they affect politics, but I don't think they're directly involved in politics. The conflict has evolved. These are criminal groups. They're not interested in toppling the state anymore.
Okay, well, whether or not they're involved in politics, how do you think this is all going to affect the election? It's just about a year away now.
Yes, we've got, I guess it's around 17 months or less now until the elections. Obviously, every opposition candidate, of which there are probably 70 of them jostling right now to garner support to run for the presidency. They're all talking about the failure of total peace, and they're all talking about the need to ratchet up military campaigns, and that these illegal groups have been given free rein in the country under Gustavo Petro.
And Felipe, the irony here is that if anyone should have understood what insurgents and the reinsertados as well, those that tried to reintegrate into society as former fighters, if anyone should have understood their plight, it should have been Gustavo Petro, being as well a former fighter himself. What happened? Where's the disconnect? Why wasn't he the one that was able to negotiate with the people that he should know so well to make this more of a success?
Yeah, it unfortunately feels we're going backwards. When we signed that peace agreement, we thought the next election will be about peace, about how to move forward with peace, and this is the greatest lost chance that we've had in the country. Unfortunately, the next election it's going to be around security. How do we strengthen the security situation, the military? How do we spend more to attack these insurgent groups? President Petro had this opportunity. He himself, being a former combatant, he will understand the situation. However, one of the biggest challenges that he is facing with his government is the lack of execution. So he's had historical budgets for agriculture, for education, but what has been the problem? No execution. So none of these huge budgets that he has secured in the past 2 years have been properly invested for the public problems that should be addressed. And so in the rhetoric or in the discourse, he keeps saying, what he has always had about peace-building conditions, about social equality, but in practice, this is not happening.
So, Sana, I mean, in the end, did disarming the FARC actually just create more armed groups and further kind of complicate the conflict in Colombia?
Well, to a certain extent, it has. I mean, it solved obviously part of the problem, but thinking that the FARC's demobilization would actually end the conflict in Colombia has proved very, very false. I think Part of what we see now is that violence has become more complex, really. Like when I was in Buenaventura in Valle del Cauca, one of these very violent departments, in 1 or 2 years ago, the people really said, like, on the one hand, conflict or violence had diminished. On the other hand, it was more complex because before they knew where the violence would come from. By now, it's no longer the FARC battling the armed forces. It's all different armed groups, and there are many more armed groups like FARC splinter groups, dissident groups, armed criminal gangs. They're all combating each other, right? So it has really become more complex. And another lesson that we learned from the FARC demobilization process as well, that there were many urban militias, FARC urban militias, that were not armed, but they were, or they were not like in the jungle, like the actual FARC combatants. And they were not part of the demobilization process. And they also really were part of the fragmentation and the splintering of new armed groups.
Okay.
So it shows us how also group fragmentation makes peace much more complex.
And it's just, we're all seem to be baffled as to how it really gets solved, because it almost seems even beyond just good governance at this point, which is another added layer, is corruption. But unfortunately, that, Sana, will have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. We're completely out of time. I'd like to thank all three of you sincerely so much for being with us. Great discussion. And our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.